everyone. I'm Pat Hubble, Candorful co-founder and executive director. Thank you for joining us for what's going to be a really cool Top Gun fireside chat to honor Veterans Day. First, thank you to those joining us who have served or are serving. Thank you to your families too. We've got a ton packed into this event, great stories, goosebump-inducing videos, and trivia prizes. This is going to be a lot of fun. First, I want to thank our awesome sponsors who helped us make this happen. Shout out to our silver sponsors, Booz Allen Hamilton, Nike, and Sands Capital. Thank you so much. Big shout out and hug to our gold sponsor, Amazon. Amazon has just sent over about 50 new coaches to volunteer for Candorful. Thank you so much for all that you do. These companies are not only bringing this event to you, but they are also committed to veteran and military spouse hiring and careers. Thank you so much. A little bit about Candorful. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We provide job interview prep for transitioning military veterans and military spouses. We are at the intersection of impact and innovation. So what does that mean? We connect our military job candidates through technology with a highly impactful community of interview coaches from industry. They are amazing and outstanding. And while we're honoring Veterans Day today, I also wanted you to know, and this is the first time I've said it out loud, we actually have hit a community milestone. We now have 101 coaches on Candorful's volunteer interview coaching platform. Our coaches are amazing. We've measured the impact that we make, and I can tell you that 98% of the people polled tell us that our impact was pivotal to their job interview success. Since my co-founder Pete Sukitz and I launched Candorful in 2018, we've supported almost 2,000 military job candidates with interview prep and practice and maintain a net promoter score of 98. We have a proven platform for helping veterans and military spouses, and your donation is critical for us to bring the impact to more military job candidates. We'll be dropping our donation link in the Q&A throughout our fireside chat. Your support makes our impact possible. And watch for that link to go into your Q&A. It'll come in shortly. Get used to using that Q&A and keeping an eye on it. So back to innovation. For us, using our innovative approach to impact is highly scalable and great fun. And speaking of innovation, before we jump over to Top Gun Tales in the Sky, let's hear from Amazon about military hiring and innovation. Hang tight. We're bringing our Top Gun pilot, Guy Snodgrass, and my co-host, Charlie Tillett, into the studio right now.
So I've been with Amazon for 2.5 years. My Amazon story starts when my enlistment ended with the Air Force. I used to work on aviation equipment. I really enjoy working for a company that's so focused on technology. They try to innovate as much as possible. So every day I come to work, it's something different. I really appreciate having an open door policy with management here at Amazon. Not only can I talk to my own boss, I could talk to the site leader, the general manager, anybody that I feel I need to. Amazon encourages free-flowing ideas. They like you to come up with ways to make things better, and they don't care where it came from. One of the fun things with Amazon is you get to travel. I got to go to a couple different sites. One of those sites, I noticed the equipment they were moving was a little bit cumbersome. So I came back here and developed this piece of hardware here that attaches to it and helps you to push it around the FC a little quicker. So after creating the prototype, I went through a patent process. Now it's patent pending, and this design is in multiple warehouses across the network. And you feel important because they listen to your individual ideas, and you see them come to fruition.
Welcome back, and thank you, Amazon. Now I want to introduce somebody very important to me. This is my friend and colleague, Charlie Tillett. He's a Candorful board member, and we met, a few years ago when we were both in the MIT Sloan School of Management. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about Charlie. He's a serial entrepreneur who was CFO for several successful VC-backed startups, but he also has some flying bona fides. He's been a pilot for over 30 years. He has over 3,000 hours of flying. He's owned 5 different airplanes, and he's currently flying a Piper Meridian. He's an active volunteer pilot for Angel Flight, providing non-emergency transportation to help people get medical treatment. And he recently completed his 200th mission. That's just awesome, Charlie. In 2020, he was awarded the Patient Benefit Flying Award by the National Aeronautic Association for his flying during the first 3 months of COVID. During this time, he flew the equivalent of 4 round-trip cross-country flights. And in terms of application to naval aviation, he tells me he spent one night aboard the USS Teddy Roosevelt aircraft carrier, about 125 miles off the coast of Virginia. So he has one carrier landing, well, as a passenger. And Charlie, you're going to need to tell me more about that.
Thanks, Pat. And actually, let's see, where's my camera here? They gave me a patch to put on my jacket for my one trapped landing on the USS Teddy Roosevelt. Before I introduce tonight's guest, just a couple of administrative things. We will be taking questions from the audience. And so as I'm asking questions, Pat's going to be compiling the questions that you ask. I understand that there's a way for questions to get moved up. And so if you see a question you like, I think you can put a thumbs up next to it and it'll move it up higher. So that goes, there's at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button. So tap that button and you can enter in your question there. We'll also, as Pat mentioned, we'll also be asking a series of questions, trivia questions. Some things that can be observed in the videos, some things that you might just know about the movies. So to answer those, just put your answer in the Q&A box as well. The first 2 correct responses to each question will get a bag of Black Rifle Coffee, which is a veteran-owned coffee company. And they'll also get a copy of the book, Top Gun's Top 10 Leadership Lessons from the Cockpit, which was written by tonight's speaker, Commander Guy Scott Snodgrass, retired. As a pilot, I could not be more excited about speaking with Commander Snodgrass. Guy graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1998 and then spent 20 years on active duty, primarily as a fighter pilot, flying the F-18, where he has over 4,000 hours. And unlike my one landing, he has 650 carrier landings. He flew combat missions during Operation Iraqi Freedom and then served as commander of a fighter wing in Japan in charge of 240 sailors and 12 fighter aircraft. He culminated his naval career working with General James Mattis, whose name you should recognize from his time as Secretary of the Defense from 2017 to 2019. Most relevant to our event tonight is Guy's time at the United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, which is quite a mouthful, but most people know as Top Gun. Guy was selected to attend Top Gun and then was asked, as you'll see in our trailer that we're watching next, like Maverick, to remain as an instructor. So before we start tonight's conversation with Guy, I thought it'd be fun to watch the trailer from the new movie, Top Gun Maverick, which is coming out in May 2022.
Your instructor is one of the finest pilots this program has ever produced. His exploits are legendary. What he has to teach you may very well mean the difference between life and death.
Your reputation precedes you.
I have to admit, I wasn't expecting an invitation back.
They're called orders, Maverick.
This is your captain speaking. Today's exercise is dogfighting.
2 versus 1? Hey, he's got to be kidding. What the hell?
Welcome back, everybody. That was so exciting. I mean, I have to tell you that almost gave me the courage to go back and learn to fly, which I definitely have been a little bit too afraid to do. But thank you so much for enjoying that video with us. I'm so psyched. So we're going to just jump right in now and start with the trivia question. I know we're holding off a little bit on getting to Guy, but we're almost there. So our first trivia question is about the video we just watched. There was a World War II warbird in that video. Now, I'm actually partial to World War II warbirds. This is my dad. He flew a P-47 in World War II, and I'm definitely the daddy's little girl, and I miss this guy a lot. Anyway, we were raised on flying stories and steerman stories, etc. Catch what the warbird was in this video. So here's what you do. If you did catch it, enter the model of the warbird in the Q&A. We will watch it, and a little later in the program, we're going to give you the answer, and then we're going to tell you who won. And back to you, Charlie.
Great. Thanks, Pat. And welcome, Guy. Great to see you. And let me start by thanking you for your service to our country. I'd like to find out a little bit more about your personal background. I kind of went through your career background, but maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Charlie and Pat. Great to be with you guys. And one thing that I don't think you explicitly called out, I mean, I'm really very thankful to be a part of the Candorful team. When I was making my own transition from uniform service to the private sector, I came across Candorful in its very early stages. And so Pat and her co-founder, Pete, had taken me under their wing, had some coaching sessions with them, and then that led to the opportunity to serve on the Candorful board. So not only am I an alumnus of Candorful, but also a member of the current board of directors alongside with Charlie. So
and I distinctly remember doing the interviews with you, and you actually knocked it out of the park. You were amazing.
Well, thank you very much. But Charlie, I think you gave me a great intro. And the one thing I guess I would add is just I think I was certainly very grateful to have a lot of the opportunities. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, you always saw taglines like "Join the Navy, see the world." Obviously, that's true for any kind of career in the military, especially the longer you're in. And, being in the military for just over 20 years and had a chance to grab 3 master's degrees during that period of time, served in the Pentagon, writing speeches for the head of the entire U.S. Navy, then subsequently, as you mentioned, doing the same thing for not only Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, but also President Trump, the military portions of his speech. So, it's just fascinating to have those kinds of opportunities. And I think it gives you a really good perspective. No matter where you slot into the military community, no matter what branch of service you're in, it gives you a really great broad perspective that then you can transition with you to the private sector to benefit other companies and organizations you're a part of.
Mm-hmm. So were you interested in flying before you joined the Navy? Were you one of these kids that always looked up at the sky? Did you have a pilot's license before you went in?
No, I didn't have a pilot's license before I joined the Navy, but yes, I was one of those kids who always knew that I wanted to fly. I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and so I was a member of Boy Scout Troop 28 here. And so every single summer we would find ourselves going to Alliance Airport or to Carswell at the time was the name of it, an Air Force base. And that's where we would make a lot of the money for the year for our own fundraising. And so, of course, you had either the Thunderbirds or the Blue Angels flying overhead, and of course, airplanes of all different types of flavors. So from a very young age, maybe 10 or 11 years old, I knew that I wanted to pursue that as a career path. And then everything kind of lined up, had a chance to go to the Naval Academy, like you mentioned, and then subsequently flight training. And that put me on the pathway to ultimately become a fighter pilot.
So what's the process when you join the Navy to get into the flying program, and then how do you get assigned to kind of the top echelon, which is flying the fighter planes?
Yeah, I think it's always the joke that Navy gets 51% of the vote. So you could have your own grand designs. It may or may not come to fruition. But one thing the Navy is really good at, much like all of the services, they're really good at running people through a selection process as they continue to move forward in their training. So typically in the flight training you conduct for the Navy and the Marine Corps, those are sister services both under the Department of the Navy. So we typically train together as we move forward. You start off in primary flight training. That's just learning the basics of flight. And from that, you can select to either go and become a helicopter pilot. You could go and become a fixed wing pilot. A lot of times it's doing, maritime patrol reconnaissance, for example. And then you could also select a pathway that sends you down jet training. And so that's the one I got selected for, was jet training. And then once I was there, at the time, there were really only two platforms you could select for. You could select for the F-18 Hornet, or you could select for the F-14 Tomcat. And we knew that the 14 was starting to sundown at that point in time. So again, really lucky, got selected for F-18 training and went out to Lemoore, California, and was off to the races.
Well, that's great. I actually looked at joining the reserve, but by the time I got around to looking into it, I was past the age cutoff. So what exactly is Top Gun?
So, like you mentioned, it's the Navy Fighter Weapons School. It's actually a school that was formed in the very tail end of the 1960s. When you think about aviation and its performance and for the military in World War II and even into the Korean War, I mean, we had really excelled. We did phenomenally well. We had advanced carrier aviation, specifically to the maritime services, to a significant degree. And then suddenly you hit Vietnam War period, and you realize that we just weren't performing like we used to. We were putting out new missiles at this point in time. They were very ineffective in combat, and we were trying to determine why that was. So all this led to a point where we were just losing too many aircraft and too many people in the Vietnam War. And so they commissioned something which became known as the Alt Report. And that's where a gentleman in the Pentagon, Captain Frank Alt, studied the problem very deeply with a group of individuals, and they came up with a whole list of things that could be done to correct it, and one of which was to create a fighter weapons school. And so that was initially stood up in Miramar, California. And after about a year or two, it started to really turn the tide in Vietnam War. And you saw our performance from the late 1960s and into the early 1970s just increase drastically. So that's how the school got its start, and then it's continued that tradition to today.
So how did you get picked for Top Gun?
So again, it's a little bit of like a high school dance. You kind of put your desires of what you'd like to do as you move forward. As a fighter pilot, you really have three options you can pursue after your first tour of duty. And so your first tour of duty is usually 3 years long. In my case, it was a combat tour. I was serving over the skies of Iraq for Operation Iraqi Freedom. And at the tail end of that, you can do really one of three things. You could go and be an instructor pilot and teach new pilots the basics of the F-18 or the basics of trainer aircraft. You could go and become a test pilot. And so then you kind of push some of the boundaries on weapons design. Sometimes it's a new aircraft as well. Or you could pursue the path I took, which was to try to be as tactical as possible in the aircraft, wanting to really master your craft. And so that usually leads to a designation as a strike fighter weapons tactics instructor, an SFTI. And so I had a chance to do that. And as part of that same application process, based on the strength of your record, the Top Gun staff kind of gets first pick, and they can say, hey, we've got 15 people coming into this class. We want this person and this person to remain on board as staff members. And as long as you perform to the level they expect during your own Top Gun training, then they'll keep you on.
Right. Awesome. So what parts of Top Gun did Hollywood get right in the movie?
Well, I mean, beach volleyball. Obviously, we play a lot of beach volleyball. But I mean, in all reality, I think the neat thing, the way the Navy handled the original movie from the mid-1980s, they partnered with the Navy. They were able to get cameras into the cockpit, cameras mounted to the aircraft themselves. So a lot of those scenes you see that I think are just iconic and that I grew up with as a kid. I was 10 years old when the movie came out, right? And so, you get these amazing catapult launches off the front of the flight deck. You get those arrested landings, or just watching the plane come into land from, seeing that from a distance. So I thought that part was great. There's other things, of course, that Hollywood takes a little bit of liberties with. You're not going to get a real Russian aircraft to fly in a movie for you, so you got to use a U.S. made aircraft. We don't play a lot of beach volleyball. I mean, it's a very serious institution. And of course, we have fun. But at the same time, I mean, you're very focused on the task at hand. And when you think about Top Gun, something most people don't know is it's not a big staff. It's all of these aviators who've come off their first tour of duty. They're relatively junior in their career path. That also means that they're very tactically relevant, and they're experts at what they do. And there's only about 20 to 25 people at any given time that represent the entirety of the Navy and Marine Corps team for aviation. And they're setting the policy and setting the tactics and the direction for both of those services for potentially years to come. And so there were some things I thought about the movie were pretty spot on and a lot of fun, capturing the energy and enthusiasm of that career path, but then some other areas, a little bit of liberty.
So you mentioned the carrier launch, and when we see the video, there's always like a break point there. The pilot's head goes forward. What causes that?
And were you saying on the takeoff or the landing?
On the takeoff.
Yeah, I think it's basically there's so much steam pressure, at least on the original catapults. We now have a new system coming online that's all propelled by electromagnet forces. But typically what happens is there's a holdback. It's keeping your aircraft in place, but you've got that full steam pressure. So right at that moment at which it releases, the whole jet kind of lurches forward for just a split second, and that throws you forward before the acceleration actually now throws you back as the plane's actually starting to move down the catapult.
Because there's two movements there, right? There's, as you said, front and
there's
back.
an initial disconnect as the holdback bar is what it's called, that holds you to the steam catapult. As that falls away to actually let your plane move, and then the acceleration starts.
Did you ever get in a dogfight?
Like a real live with an enemy aircraft?
Did you how close did you ever see other enemy aircraft while you were up flying around?
Oh, sure. Saw plenty of enemy aircraft. I mean, two of my tours of duty were in Japan. So had a chance to intercept, Russian aircraft. We'd have Russian bombers known as the Bear that would actually try to overfly the aircraft carrier, and you want to intercept them to make sure that they don't interfere with flight operations. Same thing with Chinese aircraft. Sometimes you'd have what we call interlopers, so aircraft you don't expect in the area that would maybe stumble into an area. But no, I mean, that's both a pro and a con of where we are today as America's military, is that largely we have been able to be in a position where we are fairly uncontested, especially in aerial combat. But there's a significant danger there we see, and that we're very cognizant about right now, which is if you don't face that aerial combat or that really contested environment for a decade or more, then are you starting to lose some of those skill sets that, of course, like we mentioned, led to the creation of Top Gun in the first place.
So if they would see an enemy target approaching the aircraft carrier, and they would scramble at that point to get planes into the air?
Absolutely. I mean, if we are on board the aircraft carrier, of course, one of the reasons you have these 11 aircraft carriers is for international diplomacy. I mean, obviously there's a purely military function that's right up front and center, but then there's also the opportunity to use that as a flagship for America. And so you're sailing it throughout any body of water that can handle it. And for us, that meant a lot of our time was in the Indo-Pacific, visiting foreign ports. And so you'd transit narrow straits as you were going near Taiwan or as you were passing by the Philippines. And so that's usually during a period of time where you're closer to a adversary's air bases or where they can reach you from land-based locations. And so you would set what we call an alert. So you'd have aircraft actually on the flight deck, manned up with individuals in the cockpit ready to go. And if, yes, like you said, if your radar caught someone who basically passed a certain threshold, a distance away, then they would launch those aircraft to go intercept them and make sure that they didn't hinder the aircraft carrier.
So your duty that day might be just sitting in the aircraft waiting for something to happen.
It could be. I mean, there were days, especially on bad weather days, where you needed to set the alert, but you weren't, maybe low confidence that someone was actually going to try and challenge you. Right. And you could be sitting there and just waiting to go and sit there for 2 or 3 hours and not actually launch.
So you talked about the movie not being all that. So you're saying that an airplane is not going to fly inverted over another airplane. I guess though you could technically do that, right?
Sure. I mean, I've done that myself, not that close by any stretch, but I've gone inverted near another aircraft and you hold it for a period of time. There's been plenty of people who've done that in the past. It was more prevalent in the past. We call it flat hatting, and a lot of times that's kind of or showboating, and then invariably people sour on it because that's when mishaps occur. Is you do something a little bit outside the norm, or maybe you stretch yourself too far and something unexpected happens and your aircraft touch each other, which is never a good day.
Never a good day. That's a good segue for one of the questions we have from the audience. If you don't mind me breaking in. So this is a question from Jacqueline. Hey, Jacqueline. So what is the flight maneuver you are the most proud of mastering, and what made it difficult, Guy?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. So I'm not going to give you a specific maneuver because I think that'd be challenging. I mean, there's a lot of maneuvers we do. Some to the layperson would actually seem like it's kind of aerobatic in nature. There's things called Immelman and split S. And so you use those for a tactical function. I think the thing that's somewhat related to that is when I was, and timing's everything, right? Both in your career and in life. But I happened to join Top Gun at the same time that we were creating a whole new type of tactics, a new style of going against our adversaries called fighter tactics. And it was a brand new thing. And I had actually, because of my background in math and with MIT, I got put in charge of helping to create a lot of those elements. And so not only having the chance to create it, but then to fly it, right? To actually go out there and kind of serve as a pseudo test pilot, see how it works, refine it over time. I would say that not only was it exciting to do it because you knew you were pushing the boundaries of where we were going to be for the next maybe 10, 15, 20 years, but also at the same time, having had a chance to put a stake in the ground to actually create something new that was going to have that longevity. But that's a great question.
Cool. Very cool. And speaking of MIT, one of our classmates, Charlie, and my classmate, Jeffrey Steinberg, has a question. It might be a tough one here. I don't know how you're going to handle this one. Statistically, are Top Gun graduates better pilots?
Okay, so that's I'll take it on its face. So there's really kind of two things at play there. One is, well, I guess, how would you define what's a good pilot? I would say on its face, yes, but largely because, like I mentioned earlier, your whole job is to become the master of your craft. And so you learn techniques, you learn skill sets that mean that you're incredibly diligent when you plan your flights. You make very careful risk assessments, and you learn to mitigate risk. I mean, you take some outsized risks, especially as a Top Gun instructor and as a fighter pilot in general, but then you learn very specific ways to mitigate those, to set yourself up for success. And so I think that a lot of times, anytime you can go into a subsection of a profession where you're really dialing in on how to become the master of that kind of an element, then I do think that the people produced by that program tend to be somewhere in the upper echelon.
Sorry, I muted myself. Great answer and well played as well. I want to take a minute to have a little fun with everybody. So we actually have clearly a really smart group of people, because the first trivia question had a lot of correct answers. Before I moved from asking it to working on the Q&A, there were already like 15 right answers. So the question was, what was the warbird, the antique warbird that was in the Top Gun trailer? And the answer is P-51D Mustang. And our winners are none other than Jeffrey Steinberg and Keith Leonhardt. So Keith and Jeffrey will be reaching out to you later. I'll be reaching out, asking for your mailing addresses, but our first two winners are in place. So yeah, I think with that, I'll just hop into the next question as well. Just kind of keep the whole trivia question thing going. So, I remember the first Top Gun movie really well. There might be people on the call listening in that maybe weren't alive then, or maybe were very young, but I remember it really well. And I have been waiting for the new Top Gun movie since then. I've been really waiting. And Guy, you've been my intermediate fix, and I really appreciate that. But the next question is, what year did the first Top Gun movie come out? Put it in the Q&A. And by the way, in terms of our donation link, it's going into the chat, not the Q&A. But please answer in the Q&A for what year did the first Top Gun movie came out. Charlie, back to you.
Great. So, Guy, let's talk a little bit about the F-18, and maybe we'll have a little quick little lightning round about the specs on the F-18. What does an F-18 cost?
Oh man, when I was still flying it, I want to say they were quoting anywhere from around 65 to 100 million fully loaded, which means that that's including both of the engines. You've got the targeting pods, you've got some of the associated equipment to go along with it. And I was just going to say, as a sidebar, I know you want to talk F-18 questions, but I've been really impressed during both Q&A portions where basically the question's just leaving Pat's mouth and people are already typing in the answers. So I think that's pretty good.
So what's the top speed of an F-18?
It's classified, Charlie. We can't talk about that. You know that.
Okay.
I think what they put out there is greater than Mach 1 or 1.5. The fastest I've ever gone in a plane is just over Mach 2. And that was actually in an F-16 when I was a Top Gun instructor. We would sometimes, if you had extra gas at the end of a hop, of course, you always want to try and outdo the next person. Yeah. And so you'd climb up to 50 or 55,000 feet, head away from Fallon so you don't create a sonic boom heading towards the populated area, and then basically put it into a dive and see just how fast you could go in full afterburner. So I think at that point, it was about Mach 2.2.
Okay. And so once you reach Mach 1.0, then there's no additional buffeting as you get to 2. It's just a smooth ride at that point.
That's right.
What's the climb? What's your climb rate? And I mean, it can go straight up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually have to think a little bit harder about how many feet per minute you are on that ascent. I mean, it's fast.
I Googled it real quick. It said 44,000 feet per minute, which would be, which beats my 1,500 feet per minute by a little bit. How long could you stay up in an F-18?
Yeah, I think, I think a good answer is almost indefinitely. It's probably just based on fatigue because we have aerial refueling capability. So like when I was doing Operation Rocky Freedom, you'd usually refuel 2 or 3 times. So you could triple cycle. And so you'd launch from the carrier, fly through Kuwait, head over the skies of Iraq. You would you would top off from a tanker, do a mission, come back to a tanker, do another mission, hit a tanker, and then head back to the carrier.
And the tankers would leave from a land-based. Land-based. Okay.
The aircraft carrier does have a capability. The F-18 itself, the Super Hornet, can carry external tanks, and then the centerline pod is a refueling pod. Right. And so we can do what's called organic tanking, and that means that we can basically send a tanker plane up ahead, and we can tank ourselves, if you will. But yes, especially in a large conflict like Operation Rocky Freedom, you'd have specific Air Force tankers already positioned and usually in place, ready to receive you when you got overhead.
Right, because you'd be loaded down with armaments anyway. So so
that's right. And you're burning thousands of pounds of gas as you just sit on the carrier flight deck. You get launched, climb up to altitude. You want to top yourself off so that you have maximum fuel available for your mission.
Excellent. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So it sounds like it's built for performance, not for comfort, right? It's and you're wearing a G suit in this thing. What's it like just as a pilot, just sitting in the cockpit? What's it like in there?
It is a little bit tight. I never flew the F-14 Tomcat myself, but I think planes from like that 1970s, 1980s era, like the Tomcat, the F-15 Eagle that is flown in the U.S. Air Force, those were a little bit bigger. They had a little bit more space to kind of stretch out in the cockpit, and not so much in the F-18 or in the F-35, for example. Both are pretty tight cockpits. And not only just from a size and kind of perspective, but also it's just in the F-18 specifically. I mean, just tons of switches, tons of things so it makes it difficult to carry much in the plane with you.
Mm-hmm. Is there a size limit for being a pilot?
There are. I mean, there's height requirements, there's weight requirements, and they actually will measure the length of your legs and the length of your arms because they want to make sure you can reach the dials, so your arms have to be long enough to touch everything in the cockpit, but also your legs can't be so long that if you were to eject, it would chop your leg off. So there's actually these requirements, and they've also had people who've been disqualified because they were typically too short and too light, such that if they had to eject, the ejection seat would be at risk of severely injuring them.
Well, I was going to ask about that later, but I'll ask about it now. So is there obviously, well, my guess is you've never ejected, right? That's generally not a good thing. Do they have a practice ejector seat? Do you go through ejector seat training?
They do. So you not only learn all about it. The one we had in the F-18 was made by Martin Baker. And so you would have the opportunity to basically familiarize yourself with a mock-up, but then also when you're going through training in Pensacola and also specific to your aircraft type, they'll put you in essentially that seat and you simulate what it would be like to actually eject, and then it kind of shoots you up. It's not too far up, but they just want to get you familiar with the procedure and then also what the initial expectation is for timing and the force. And
a chute deploys and you float down, or?
No, you don't actually leave the rail. So it's like it kind of shoots you up a rail a little bit and then you come back down.
Okay. So how much flying would you typically do in a week? How much, how busy as a pilot were you? How much downtime was there, and what did you do during downtime?
Sure. So at least in the Navy and the Marine Corps, and the Navy specifically, you go through these different portions of a cycle. And it basically defines your, what we call your maintenance phase, which is when you're usually have a little bit more downtime and you're repairing your aircraft. Your next phase would be your pre-deployment phase. So you're training and you're getting yourselves ready. You're basically getting the aircraft and the individuals who fly back on step. you deploy and then you come back and you have a post-deployment phase where you could be called upon to go back out pretty quickly thereafter. It's interesting because I've had two different experiences. The first squadron I was in was a based out of the continental United States. And so you lived on that normal cycle. The next two squadrons I was in were part of what's called the Forward Deployed Naval Force. And that's, in this case, stationed out of Japan. We have an aircraft carrier that's there 24/7, 365, and those squadrons are also there with it in case there's any kind of conflict that arises in the Indo-Pacific with Korea, with China, with Russia, others. And so that's unique because what you find is that those squadrons are traditionally funded at a much higher level. And so you're flying like crazy. And sometimes we'd actually say you'd fly to the detriment of your training, meaning that you would have to fly twice a day. Sometimes, 3-4 times a week, you're flying twice. The other days you're flying once. And on board the aircraft carrier, it's even different because there's really not, of course, as you might imagine, being on an aircraft carrier, there's not a lot to do outside of flying. So you could be flying 2-3 weeks straight before you get a weekend off, but you just fly every single day.
Yeah, because it's not just training for you, the pilot, when you're doing operations. It's the whole group. It's the whole group that's on the crew, that's on the flight deck, and everyone involved in the air traffic control room. And so there's a lot of people that they want to keep, kind of at their sharpest, right?
That's true. And that's one of the things I thought was great about the military experience was just the fact that it's one of those ultimate team sports, right? When you think about the aircraft carrier, it's a great visual example. You've got that one individual typically in a cockpit, especially in a fighter plane. And that's what you think of. But to make that happen, to launch and recover aircraft, you've got 4,000 or 4,500 other sailors on board the ship who are doing everything from food preparation, making sure the aircraft carrier itself is running smoothly, maintenance on the aircraft. I mean, you name it, and they're doing it. And so to kind of bridge to the experience with Candorful, that's something that I thought was great with Candorful and some of the companies that I've had a chance to interact with that are benefiting Candorful is that they recognize that team spirit. They recognize the fact that a lot of the men and women coming out of the military are used to working really well together. They're high performing, and they love operating as a high functioning team. And so when you think about some of our sponsors, even, Amazon, Booz Allen and others, they do a great job of assessing these military service members. And I thought, just as a kind of a shameless plug for Candorful, I thought that's something I really appreciated with my own experience when I first went through the Candorful process, was learning how to better recognize and articulate a lot of the skill sets that you pick up in uniform and how those can relate to the private sector.
So I got one last question. And even though I suspect there's a simulator for the F-18, there's nothing like getting in the airplane itself, and it's a single pilot airplane. What's it like doing the first solo in a $65 million airplane, and what's it like doing your first carrier landing in one?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the question. That's the question I was very concerned with as a student was, hey, who's coming with me to land this thing on an aircraft carrier for the first time? And the answer is nobody. It's you all by yourself. So yeah, I'll never, of course, your first time you solo is incredible. I had actually been the benefactor of so I was a graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, but they have a program that each service academy does where you can be selected to be a exchange student to another service academy. So I went to the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs for a semester. And they had a program there called Soaring, where you fly gliders. And so I had actually had a chance to solo a glider as a college student, which taught you the basics of flight and everything else. So that kind of checked off the list. And then now suddenly you're flying a fighter jet and you're getting to solo that for the very first time. And then you take it one step further where you're going out overhead the aircraft carrier. You look down from 20,000 feet, the thing looks like a postage stamp or smaller from that altitude. And you're thinking, there's no way I'm going to land this jet on that thing. But your training kicks in and you come around, you do everything you plan for in the simulator and you practice on the field before you go to the carrier and you're ready for it and you make it happen.
Yeah, you can practice on the field. I'm sure they have a carrier space, spray painted out on the ground, but that ground is not doing this.
That's right. And by the way, I just want to throw out my apologies. I had the setting sun coming in, and that's why you saw me flip on a light, and then it looked like it blasted me. So I guess I'm just going to kind of go with this for the moment.
It looks very mystical.
It does. It looks very Halloween.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's all good. Hey, this might be a great time to break and ask you a couple of questions from the audience. This is just so unbelievable and over the top for me to listen to. I appreciate it. So you guys actually talked about life on the carrier. What is the fitness regimen like for a fighter pilot, and what kind of diet exercises did you follow or do you follow?
So I'm embarrassed to say that for some portion of my career, especially as a junior officer, well, one, your fitness program isn't directed, so it's basically on your own recognizance. You've got to do what you need to do to make sure you're staying fit. You can keep up with the aircraft and the maneuvers and everything else you're doing. Most individuals, as you might expect, in the fighter community are fairly driven and want to, run, lift weights, do what you need to do. But I will say that there were times, even as a Top Gun instructor, where you're just moving so fast and you just have a lot on your plate. So you just grab a Snickers bar and, a soda or a Coke, in between one flight and as you're running to your debrief or something else. And it's something I'm not letting my kids do these days.
Charlie wouldn't let me do that preparing for half marathons. He'd make me eat RX bars instead. I don't know. We'll have to talk with Guy later, Charlie, about nutrition. So another question we have from somebody here. I'm just gonna read it verbatim. So, hi, Mr. Snodgrass. Grass is greener type question here from someone who is unable to join the military. What is the best, most interesting non-military career that you have seen within the national security domain?
Oh, that's great. I'll be honest. There's a lot that are kind of tied, if you will. So I had, as Charlie had mentioned up front, I'd had a chance to serve at the highest levels of federal government. I was in Secretary Mattis's front office. I was tied very closely with the White House and others. And so that gave me a really good perspective on what other branches of national security, the intelligence community, what they do. It really kind of comes down to what you're most excited about and what you're passionate about, because those types of jobs are there. If you really enjoy communications, if you enjoy travel, the State Department is fantastic. We have a lot of foreign service officers who, of course, live in embassies and serve overseas. And so much like the military, you get a chance to not only serve, but to travel the world and serve as a direct ambassador with other nations and with their leadership. Like I mentioned, you have the intelligence community. So once again, you might find yourself kind of going to some very interesting locations. If you're an operator, if you're an analyst, then you might be working for the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency. You've got, I think the fun thing, and it's tough for me to make a call because I think like a lot of us on this conversation, you're intellectually curious. And so you could be at the Department of Energy learning about nuclear power, and that's pretty darn cool. And then you go and talk to someone from the Department of State. So the thing that I thought was great about it is that there's just anything you're interested in, you can probably find a pathway to public service and still pursue your passion, but be in a position to contribute to the nation and to other Americans.
Very cool. So
great answer.
That's really, I think, eye-opening as well. What are your thoughts on the F-35, asks Brian?
Yeah, so we were very actively developing it when I was still a Top Gun instructor, and that was back in 2006, 2008. And then as I continued my career, I would have some interaction with it alongside some others in the test community. Really good aircraft. I mean, it's got some phenomenal capabilities. There were a lot of lessons in this case that the aircraft manufacturer Lockheed Martin had learned from the F-22 Raptor, which is still probably the predominant air dominance platform for the U.S. Air Force. And so a lot of those lessons got fed into the F-35. And the F-35, if you think about, that progression that you've seen throughout history, even if you just go back kind of like I mentioned, the Vietnam War, planes were you had pulleys and you had wires that were controlling those flight surfaces based on your input on the flight stick. Then you get into planes like I flew, the F-18, where we always joke that the pilot was a voting member because the flight control computers would do a lot of the computations and actually tell the plane what to do. You were just giving it the input of what you hoped and desired to see the plane do. Now you get to the F-35. It's a whole new breed of things like system of systems, very technologically advanced. You're bringing in all of the sensors you have on your plane. You can fuse it through sensor fusion and come up with a really good picture of the battle space and how you can, I guess in a very blunt way, fight and win our nation's conflicts. And so It's a great airplane. I think the only hit I would give against it is that it's an expensive aircraft. And so that's the danger, not just with that platform, but as we look at how the U.S. military continues to develop, we're fielding more and more exquisite, technologically advanced platforms, but you're getting fewer and fewer of them because of how expensive those price tags are. And that affects everything from training to how many are actually available on a daily basis to conduct missions. And so that's something I think from a policy standpoint, we've got to be very cognizant of.
That's really interesting. Really interesting. A lot of, as always, a lot of pros and cons of trying to figure out how things will work together. One more question, then we're going to talk trivia again. So John Perez has a question, really interesting one. Many countries have great pilots. From your experience, would you say Israeli pilots are among the best along with our pilots?
Yeah, I'd say Israeli pilots are very good. We train very heavily with the United Kingdom, with Australia. The one thing that, in fact, I was at a conference a few weeks ago with a member of the Israeli military, and one thing that I said to them, which I'll share here, is simply that I think your life changes a little bit when you're living in a nation where you constantly feel like you have some form of an existential crisis. And so Israel certainly fits that bill. And so you can only imagine that there's a very heightened sense of awareness that there's threats that you feel like you're surrounded by. And so you have to be on your A game consistently. And so they put a lot of time and effort into their training to make sure that they're on step.
All right. Thanks for answering those questions. We'll work our way down the list. We've got quite a few, but I want to go right back to the trivia questions for a little bit of fun. Oh my God, so many answers. A lot of them were right. Some of them were wrong. But the question was, when did the Top Gun movie came out? It was 1986. Yes, I remember where I was too. And our winners are Matt Williams and Brian Roeder. So we'll be in contact with you for some coffee and Guy's book. And with that, I'm gonna get us psyched up and ready for the next video. But we're gonna throw out a third trivia question for you guys to think about. Now, be careful. Don't go researching this question and miss the next video, because the next video is just outstanding. It's just unbelievable. So the answer to this third trivia question is actually in the photo in our event emails that we sent out and most of our social media posts. So I'm sure everyone was looking really closely at all these social media posts and all these emails. I'm positive of it. But a matter of fact, I even put a hint in this morning with a social media post. But if you looked very closely, you could tell what Guy's call sign was. So we're going to watch this next video while you guys try to figure out what Guy's call sign was. And with that, don't miss the video looking for the answer. So go for it. Let's see some real Top Gun video filmed by Guy and his squadron mates.
Can you see it? The worst is over. The monsters in my head are scared of love. Falling people, listen up. It's never too late to change your love. So don't let them steal your life. Don't let them break your stride. There's light on the other side. You'll see all the raindrops falling behind. It's a revolution, and we'll make it out tonight. It's a revolution. It's a revolution.
I'm enamored with this video, as Guy knows. It actually comes from a 5-minute video, and I actually voted to have the whole 5 minutes in there, but I was outvoted. It's an amazing video. I was going to remind everybody to answer question number 3 in the Q&A, but again, the answers came so incredibly fast that you can stop answering. I'll give you the answer in a little while. Back to you, Charlie.
So, Guy, you mentioned teamwork and teamwork on the aircraft carrier. I noticed people are wearing different colored shirts. Can you explain do you just feel like a yellow shirt day and put on your yellow shirt, or what?
That's right. You just wake up one day, you're just kind of feeling a little down. You're going to wear your brown shirt. So each shirt kind of typifies a specific function that you're going to play. So typically those you see wearing the brown shirts are going to be, for example, maybe those are the plane captains. They're the ones who are actually preparing the plane for flight. When you land, they park you and put we call it chalk and chain, right? So you put the chocks in front of the tires, and they actually chain you down to the flight deck so that as the aircraft carrier is moving on the ocean, that it doesn't, your plane doesn't roll forward or off the flight deck. Red shirts would be for ordnance, so they handle the bombs and bullets. You've got green shirts, which are doing sometimes avionics or your engine. So every color, it's a very easy way to identify their major role and function. And that way, if you're an extremist, you can very quickly get to the person you need to, even if they're from another squadron. If you need help quick, they can do that. And I was just going to say real quick, I know during the video, someone caught it, and which was great. So yes, that video is actually from VFA 195. That's when I was a commanding officer of a fighter squadron. And they referenced that the name of the squadron is the Dam Busters. And yes, there was a squadron from World War II that got that name because they specially designed a bomb that could skip over the water to take out a dam. And likewise, that's how the U.S. Navy fighter squadron that I led got the name Dam Busters, was because during the Korean War, there was the Hwachon Reservoir Dam that was basically kind of close to the border of South and North Korea. And they were trying to stop the advance of North Korean and Chinese troops. They were trying to take out this dam. They were using bombs. They would just pretty much bounce harmlessly off, if you think about 1950s bombs. And someone came up with the great idea that, hey, we've got these World War II era torpedoes still on board the aircraft carrier. How about if we put those on our planes, and then instead of just hitting the front side of a dam, we actually drop the torpedo on the backside and let it run through the water and blow the dam up. And that's what they did. It worked, and it flooded the valley below, and that's how they got the call sign, the Dam Busters, or the nickname.
And if I could put in a plug there, is I believe it's a Nova special on that that talks about how they designed the bomb, how they practiced it, and so it's try and find that. It's got to be on YouTube somewhere. So I noticed on your plane, on the plane you were flying, Guy, your name is on that plane. So do you get assigned an airplane, and then while you're deployed, that is your plane?
No, unfortunately, you have more pilots than you do planes. You typically have anywhere from 10 to 12 jets per squadron, and you have more pilots than that. So there wouldn't be enough planes to go around in that case.
Okay.
What they do is it's basically a seniority system. So as every first plane of a squadron belongs, if you will, to the CAG, to the Air Wing Commander, and so their name will be painted on it.
Okay.
Then you get to, like in my case, the ordinal number for the jets started with 4. So it was a 400 series for the Dam Busters. I was a squadron commander, so the first jet after that would be 401. That was my jet, had my name on it, and some others as well. And then as you go down the line, it just goes in order of seniority.
Okay, but you could actually fly any of the jets.
That's right. You could fly any jet that they had available. Sometimes, it'd be a bummer if your jet was in maintenance for a month and you just had to sit there and fly. So yes, you can fly any plane that's available.
Okay, I was just curious about it. So, but then when you leave that deployment, then they take your name off the plane, right?
Right. When you leave the squadron, they'll take your name off, and then they'll rotate in the next person who is the most senior. And especially as a junior officer, when you're in your very first squadron, it's a pretty cool event when your name goes up on the side of a jet.
I'll bet. And kind of sad when your name comes off too.
That's right.
In the video, we also saw Chippy. The term Chippy.
Yes.
What's that?
So Chippy is basically the comm brevity term. So your squadron call sign or your squadron name could be the Dam Busters, but that's way too many syllables for the radio. So we would just go with Chippy. And it came out of the Korean War around the same time that we got the name Dam Buster. Chippy's just a bird. And so, so we're the Chippies. You'd have the Lions. You'd have The Hawks, whoever, whatever their shortened call sign is. And a lot of times you'll use that on the radio as well, just because it's a very quick term to get out.
So you use your call sign on the radio, right?
Not my personal. You never use your personal call sign because you don't want to be personally identified, especially if you're in a conflict zone. But you would say, like, if our squadron call sign's Chippy, then you'd say, like, Chippy 2-3, or
so you wouldn't use bug on the radio?
Bus?
I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm going to answer the trivia question. I'm going to answer the trivia question so that we can get into some questions about it. So your call sign was bus, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so you would not use that call sign on the radio?
No.
Okay. So this was just for your teammates to refer to you when they weren't, of course, saluting.
Yeah, everything else you do, you'd use your call sign. So you'd have a kneeboard card, that you fly with. It's got all your flight information. And when they put the flight assignments and if you're flying, let's say as a group of 4, you'd have bus in there as your call sign because you wouldn't use your real name. But you're correct. On the radio, you don't typically use your personal call sign unless it's extremis. One of the things they teach you, though, is that, for example, if there's a problem with the oxygen or cabin pressurization and someone were to pass out, one of the best ways to try and revive them is to use their personal call sign because they're more likely to actually trigger off of it. And actually, you have a better chance of waking them up. But other than extremis, I've not heard many personal call signs used on the radio.
Okay. So when I hear fighter planes on my frequency when I'm tooling around, they're just using their squadron or whatever. They're using the equivalent of Chippy, and then they're using whatever, Chippy 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
To identify their airplane. Okay, yep. Interesting. Because you can often hear them on the radio. So how do call signs get assigned? And with a name like Snodgrass, did your buddies go easy on you when they came up with a call sign of bus?
Yeah, I was laughing. I saw some funny Q&A responses to call sign, and some of which were last name related. So no, you never pick your own call sign. That's rule number 1. Some people have tried it. It does not end well. So typically it's one of 2 things. It's usually either, it could be name related. It could be something that's like a physical feature about you. There was one guy we had who had just a really large nose and his call sign was schnoz. And then if it's not that, then it's usually going to be because you've done something worthy of earning a call sign. We had one gentleman flying a plane when I was a junior officer. His radio was stuck on. He didn't know this. He's sitting on the flight deck and he is just cursing out all the sailors. They couldn't hear him, but everybody on the flight deck and in the control tower could. And he got the call sign cuss after that. And then, but like that first example, we had one guy who was a Blue Angel. His call sign was Bunza because his last name was Steelman. So it was Bunza Steelman. So sometimes it's, something clever that can fit with your name. And then other times it's something you earn.
So how'd you get yours?
It was kind of right place, right time, I guess, in that I had joined my first fighter squadron at the same time. The Pittsburgh Steelers were the kind of the team to beat, and they had a player named Jerome Bettis. Yeah, just a huge running back, a black guy, and so it was. I mean, I show up in the squadron as this kind of scrawny white kid, and they're like, you couldn't think of a person more opposite of that, athlete than Bus. Yeah. So that's how I got the call sign because his, Jerome Bettis was called the Bus.
Mm-hmm. You must have had some scary moments flying.
Yes.
Any that you could share with us? Maybe one?
Oh, sure. I mean, none of them are classified. I had my very first one was actually when I was learning to fly the F-18. I was in training in Lemoore, California. In fact, for the lucky recipients of one of the books, there's a whole chapter kind of dedicated to an emergency situation when I was a flight student where in the F-18, you have 2 engines, a left and a right engine. And my right engine exploded during a dogfight, completely seized up. And, the aircraft's now losing altitude. And so I kind of recount what that was like to have to declare an emergency and get it on deck before you crash, because it's a mountainous region. And for some reason, we just couldn't maintain altitude. I had another one where the control surfaces locked up and I was going about 600 miles per hour, about 500 feet over the water in what we call the carrier brake. And so that's where you're getting ready to land on the carrier. You fly over it first and you do this racetrack pattern to land. And so a lot of times you want to come in real fast and real low. And my flight lead, I was the wingman. So the flight lead brought us in incredibly fast, very low. He peels off. My preordained time later, I go to turn and do the same thing, and I lose the flight controls, and so it actually rolls inverted upside down and starts to go towards the water. And when you're going that fast and you're already that low, stuff's going to happen pretty fast. So I was able to kind of scoop it out, but when I did so, I was only about 200 feet off the surface of the water, going about 600 miles an hour. So that'll wake you up. That's the best cup of coffee. And so the cool thing about all those emergencies is that you don't realize it at the time, but it's always stretching you. It's always teaching you how to remain calm under pressure, and how to really understand the limits of your aircraft. And then it gives you a better perspective that there are some incidents that occur that are, in the hindsight, relatively minor, and you can handle those without much problem. And then there are some that really are significant events, and you have to treat those differently. And so it really kind of starts to, like I mentioned earlier, you learn risk mitigation a lot. So you also learn how to handle yourself under times of crisis and extreme pressure, and how to respond accordingly.
Mm-hmm. So the F-18 is a beautiful airplane, and it looks like a ton of fun to fly, but it was designed to blow stuff up.
That's right.
So maybe can you tell us something about the armaments aboard the plane, and just something about how you deploy that, and kind of
Sure.
the process behind that?
Sure. One thing that makes the F-18 really unique is actually in the name, right? It's the FA-18. Most planes you see, most fighter planes, the F-16 Viper or Fighting Falcon, the F-15 Eagle, right? So it's almost a purely fighter role plane. The F-16 does a little bit of both. The FA-18 by design was meant to be both fighter and attack. And that's because when you think about the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, the amount of space you have when you're roaming the world's oceans, there's just not a lot of area to keep different types of planes. And so if you could have one plane that does multiple roles, wouldn't that be nice? And so that's probably the neatest thing about the F-18 is that you could carry the full complement of air-to-air missiles and weapons. So you could be a great dogfighter. You could do long-range fights against other enemy aircraft. Correspondingly, you could carry some missiles, but then have a full loadout of bombs. And that way you could go in, kind of fight your way into a contested area, drop your bombs on the intended target, and then fight your way back out if you had to.
Mm-hmm. And the bombs is it GPS controlled? How are they?
Sure.
Yeah,
there's a variety.
I remember the old World War II movies. They have a sight and a clock, and someone's doing calculations and hit the button now. But now is it, just like the planes are fly by wire, the bombs are fly by wire?
We have a mix. So, we do still have the unguided general purpose bombs. And so those are, there are computers to help you, but it's put yourself into a dive, calculate the right angle and the right release point at the right speed and altitude. And then it's purely just by gravity and the ballistics that it's going to hit. And so you could be, if you don't do it correctly, you could be wildly off. We do have laser guided weapons so that you can use a laser on your own aircraft or another aircraft to guide that weapon in, and it'll follow that laser all the way to a perfect hit. You've got GPS guided weapons. You have other weapons that can use imagery, for example. So if it knows what the target area should look like, it can actually kind of find the right target and home in on it. So there's a wide variety of ways that you can guide weapons to their target.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's close this segment on a little bit of a lighter note. We saw some beautiful scenery at the end of that video that you had. What are some of the most spectacular? I know I can think of, just a dozen sights that I've seen out of my cockpit window. What are a few of the most memorable that you've had from your flying career?
Yeah, I think two really come to mind. I mean, obviously, I flew near Europe. I flew in the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, here, of course, all across the continent of the United States. Anytime you're up at altitude and you're looking out and you're seeing kind of the earth pass underneath you, it's really cool, especially when you're moving at those speeds. So it's just a great view to get a better sense. And I always found it romantic over the United States. You get a kind of a real condensed view of like, hey, this is America. You're transiting from a very urban area and a high density in the eastern seaboard, and then you kind of get more to the open area and the plains, and then suddenly you're landing again in California, and so you just learn the country. The two that really stand out, I think, were one, anytime you're flying over the open ocean and you're hundreds of miles away potentially from the aircraft carrier, and suddenly you're returning home, and we call the aircraft carrier mom, and so there's mom, and she's steaming, and this aircraft carrier with close to 5,000 people on board. I mean, it's just once again, it's a really cool site. The other one that I think is very just specific was my first tour of duty in the Middle East when we were in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And you know, there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these oil refineries and drilling wells in the Gulf. And so, of course, at night, every single one of them has a stack as they're burning off the excess or the dangerous gases. And so the whole Gulf is just lit up like these, you know, candles, like someone's epic birthday cake. So that was pretty cool to see as well.
Yeah. Well, I would have to echo that, because now that I wouldn't have thought of this until you made this comment, but the most beautiful thing that I've seen flying is breaking out of the clouds at 200 feet and having the runway right in front of you with the runway lights on.
Yeah.
So,
and conversely, if you break out 200 feet and the runway's over there,
that's not a good sign. So, Pat, any audience questions?
We have a lot of audience questions, and they're all over the place, but I think we're going to do a bunch of them. I was trying to keep them in order, but we're just going to kind of do a bunch of them. So career-wise, what was it like to work and write speeches for General Mattis? And do you have any funny or cool stories about working with him?
Sure. So talk about an honor. I mean, really and truly, to be in a position, again, that's something I thought was so fantastic about a military career, is that you think you're joining to be a pilot. You think you're joining to do a specific role. And then you do that, but then you have these opportunities for stuff that is just so wildly outside of where you ever thought you'd be. And so if you told me I'd be roaming the halls of the White House talking to the vice president or the secretary of defense, 5 years earlier, I would have said you're crazy. But I think that was what really stood out. I mean, not only was it just the access and being in the meetings with the senior world and national leaders, it really opens your eyes for how diplomacy and how politics works and how you govern a country. But at the same time, it was, you realize there was this not a bad weight, but there was just this gravity to the situation, because so many times if I wrote material for President Trump or Secretary Mattis, a lot of times they didn't have time to like thoroughly go through it. So you had to be accurate. You had to be right. You have to know very well what the topics were and what the right answers were, or the policy position was, so that you could make sure that what you handed your boss was accurate the first time around. And so I thought it was a very challenging job. Secretary Mattis is not necessarily an easy boss by any stretch. He has very high standards, but I really appreciated that. And I think, just like with Top Gun, just like with being in other positions, it stretches you in a new direction. There's that lifelong learning aspect to it, and you just become a master of a different craft.
So it sounds a little bit like preparing for a Candorful board meeting. Just saying.
There you go.
Great. If you had the opportunity to fly any aircraft in the U.S. inventory, what would it be and why?
Oh, wow. I think two come to mind. When I was a kid growing up, I was a huge fan of spy planes. My goal, my dream was to become initially an Air Force fighter pilot or a pilot in general, because I wanted to fly the SR-71 Blackbird, which was just this phenomenal plane built by Lockheed Martin that, incredibly high, incredibly fast, Mach 5 plus, and it just looks really cool. So I wanted to fly that, but it's no longer flying. So if I had to take a second choice, it's another Lockheed plane, but that was the U-2 spy plane. I mean, that one goes just as high up, much slower, but it can loiter for a long period of time. And I've had friends who were U-2 pilots, and to see some of the photography they take where you can see the entire curvature of the earth from that altitude, I thought was just breathtaking.
Wow. I swear I might actually have the guts to take a flying lesson. Well, maybe not, but this has got me really excited. Here is a great, very practical question. I'm dying to know the answer. Did you ever deal with motion sickness? And if so, how do you cope with it?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. When I first started flying, I actually had a few flights where I was like, man, I may not be cut out for this. And it's because the first 3 or 4 flights. So I also, not only did I go to the Air Force Academy for a period of time, but I also cross-trained. My very first plane I flew was the Air Force T-37 called the Tweed. It's a twin-engine jet trainer. And so I was flying in the Air Force, and unlike the Navy, where you'd wear a flight suit, you'd have a headset and a boom mic, and you'd jump in your prop plane to go fly. Now you're flying a very fast jet, and your oxygen mask, helmet, from the get-go, you're covered from head to toe with cloth or plastic of some kind. So I felt it was very not claustrophobic, but everything's covered, and it just felt weird breathing controlled air. And so I got sick my first 3 or 4 flights, and I was actually concerned that I might wind up watching out of the program. And so the simple fix was basically to talk to a flight doc about it and figure out the right tip. And their question was, what are you doing pre-flight? And I'm like, well, I starve myself. I don't eat anything because I don't want anything to come up. And he's like, man, that's the worst thing you could do. Like, eat a normal breakfast, eat bananas because they taste the same coming up as they do going down. And hydrate. And so I did that. And next thing you know, it was like, oh, piece of cake. Let's rock on.
Bring on those bananas. Bring on those bananas. All right. This is a great one. I love this question from Michelle McManam. What was your biggest struggle when transitioning out of the military and looking for a career? And what are you doing now? Sure.
There's probably, if I had to think about it, there's probably like a top 5 list of things that, and I think it all varies on the path you've taken. I think if you transition early from the military to the private sector, it's actually an easier transition because you're less kind of attuned or less inculcated into the military lifestyle. You did your time and now you're going to go explore other things. In my case, I had done a total of 24 years, including the Naval Academy. And so I had spent a quarter century in uniform, and you don't realize how attuned or how used to that you become. And especially whether as an enlisted or an officer, you're climbing the chain that entire time. So you could be a senior enlisted, a senior officer. I was a fairly senior officer, and I'd worked at very senior levels. And so you just kind of become used to, great, I'm going to have a team that's going to help me enact the vision I have or the things I need to accomplish. And suddenly when you transition, you realize, ooh, you're not quite on your own per se, but you've got to figure out what you want to do and how you want to do it, and really invigorate that activity, so that, because you're going to have to do it yourself in many cases. Things that I thought worked really well in the transition, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, there are organizations just like Candorful that are dedicating themselves to helping service members make that adjustment and prepare themselves adequately. One thing I did horribly was I didn't give myself enough time to transition. It was kind of a more of a spur of the moment, because I realized the path I'd been on, my family and I wanted to pursue a different path. And so it was like, man, let's rip the Band-Aid off and go. And I could have done a better job setting myself up and my family up for that transition. We could have had more, 6 months or a year rather than a few months to really think about that. So there are definitely a lot of things you can do. Yeah, go ahead.
Unintended comment, right? Because I love when people come to Candorful 6 months or a year in their transition, because they have the opportunity to not only do really well but flop completely and then come back and do it again. So I think thank you for letting me make that little pitch there. Go ahead, back to you.
Sure, no, absolutely. And I think that, it's one of those things where it's interesting on both, as a military service member, you have to make adjustments to a brand new state of being. The private sector, and especially corporate America, is not like the military in a lot of ways. And at the same time, that also means there's a little bit of a burden, I guess, on the employers to help bridge that gap, because you're bringing in raw talent. You're bringing in people who are very accomplished and are very typically dedicated to the mission. They communicate well, they're team players, but they may not have as much experience, of course, in the private sector and in the way that operates. So there's always a little bit of a dance. And I think that the people who do transition really well are the ones who can handle uncertainty, roll with the punches, and are willing to really invest not only in themselves, but also in the teams around them to move forward and do well. And the question was, what am I doing now? So basically, used to go on 600 miles an hour in a jet, and I've liked doing that in my own way. I started, I was with a startup company. I'm now doing some nonprofits. I've got several companies of my own. I've written a couple of books. So I think I'm still at that age where I really like kind of keeping the pedal down, just seeing, what kind of new things I can get into, because there's a lot of really exciting things to do post-military.
Speaking of your book, I just looked at the time, and my goodness, we're having so much fun. The time is flying. So I'm going to switch from audience questions, which are amazing, and go back to our third trivia question. You all know the answer already. It was bus. And the people who answered the fastest were Krista Cass. So great to see Krista on here, and Joseph Gerard. So we'll be in touch with you about your coffee and your book. And I'm going to jump into our final trivia question. And I actually saw a little bit of conversation about it going on some of my texting. So we'll see who answers fast. Be prepared, everybody. So in the last video that you watched, the Dam Busters video, what was the snow-covered mountain in the flyby? Put it in the Q&A, not the chat. In the Q&A, the first two will be prize winners. We will give you the answer as we start to wrap up in about the answers.
You've already got winners.
Okay. All right. And with that, back to, I really want to give a guy a chance to talk about his awesome book, which, by the way, a lot of my family members are going to see this under the Christmas tree. So, I think it's an excellent book for many ages. This is one of my favorite books ever. Back to you, Charlie.
Yeah. So, Guy, maybe we could kind of going back to what we started on talking about Top Gun. What were some of the qualities that made someone a successful Top Gun pilot?
Yeah, and thanks, Pat, for the kind words. This relates right back to a story in the book, but it's talent, passion, and personality. Those are the three things we said we're always looking for. And you kind of had to have those in equal measure. You had to be at least credible, if not hopefully well above being credible in the jet as a tactician, as a pilot, et cetera. If you were not talented, then it would be tough to be credible as an instructor or as a graduate. Passion needed to be there because, like I referenced, you're working incredibly long hours. I mean, it was not unusual to show up at work 5:30 in the morning, and on some occasions, same day, you're leaving somewhere around 10 or 11 p.m. just so you can go home, grab a quick bite to eat, collapse, and do it again. So you had to be really passionate about it to stick with that kind of extreme circumstance. And then the personality was also just as equally important because you could be very talented, be very passionate, and a complete jerk, and no one's going to want to work with you or learn from you. And part of being a Top Gun instructor in particular is you need to be able to effectively convey the lessons and help train the other teachers around you. And so we were always looking for talent, passion, and personality.
Okay. And really, it sounds like the same qualities for being a successful pilot as well as for being a successful instructor there, right?
Yeah, and I think, it's funny because, it sounds like three simple things, but they're so important. And I suspect if you were to pulse a lot of men and women in the business community or medical community, any profession, some form or flavor of those type of three elements are going to be there, right? You've got to be passionate about it. You've got to have a great personality, et cetera.
Right. I mean, I've spent my career in startups, but having the person who has the most technical knowledge but can't be a team player is actually a net negative for the organization. So I totally get how that skill set will transition to the private sector.
I kind of underscore. I really have to underscore this because we have a lot of employers actually tuning in today, and I think the sponsors we have in particular get this, that having team players as a part of their team is essential. And I really want other companies to think about this because I know obviously Amazon gets it. Their military hiring is huge. So do Nike, Booz Allen Hamilton, Biz Capital, they get it. If you have people that can work as a team, everything else can be learned and taught. This is something really important and reach into the military for hiring. Sorry, had to interrupt.
Yeah, perfect. So penultimate question is, what is the lesson that you have learned that has continued to serve you most in your personal life?
Great question. In some respects, it's probably perseverance. Pat mentions teamwork. I mean, there's so many things, but I think if you find yourself passionate about pursuing or achieving anything in your career, in your life, with your family, there's always adversity that's in front of you in some form or fashion. And it's that ability to recognize it, to overcome it, and to still stay the course, especially if you recognize that the course you were on is the right one. Yeah. Then that just means so much because it means that you're willing to invest the time, effort, and energy to be successful. And that's not only a great trait while you're wearing the uniform, but I've also found that employers really appreciate that because they realize that they've got a member of their team who is dedicated to team success and wants to help make that a reality.
Well, I mean, we didn't rehearse these answers or these questions, but I read I've listened to a couple of interesting business folks, and kind of unanimously, they say that grit is the number one criteria that we're looking for in people. It's not having the perfect skill set for the job, but it's having what you said, the perseverance to figure out a way to get the job done, because people can learn the job skills, but it's really hard to teach grit.
Yeah, so it's funny. I was just going to chime in real quick because I know we're getting close on time, but there was actually a story that I read recently, and maybe Forbes or some such, but it was it was an individual sharing their experience of being hired at Amazon, personally by Jeff Bezos to be one of his, I guess, executive secretaries or assistants. And that's essentially the outcome. It was presented with this off the wall crazy question. It was basically, how many windows are in Seattle? How do you calculate that?
Yeah.
And she said that it wasn't that she knew the right answer or even some kind of equation. It was, can you control yourself, stay calm, cool, collected, think logically about how would you figure that out? How would you get to that answer? He's up there kind of helping her along whiteboarding. He's like, yeah, that mental pathway you took sounds about right. And you stuck with it. And so when can you start? And so to your point, yeah, it's that determination, it's that grit to hang with it.
So my last question is, after all of the excitement of learning to fly the F-18, flying at Mach 2, doing a night carrier landing, now that you're not flying, what do you do for excitement?
Yeah, I think it's a variety of things, right? Like there's never just one thing in life. I have to admit, I still own a motorcycle, so I enjoy riding that. I mean, it's kind of that pure connection to some type of vehicle. You're going fast, you get the wind and stuff, so that's a lot of fun. I will tell you that from a personal standpoint, like I mentioned earlier, I really love business. I love charting a course that's non-standard. And so as Pat knows, I'm very hard to put into a box, because my wife even says, people will say, what is your husband doing? She's like, he's a professional dabbler. But that's what I am really just excited about is charting the non-standard path. That's why I've started several companies. I love consulting. I love working with these Fortune 500s, because every single one of them is different. They all have different cultures and flavors, but all of them are really just good at what they do. And so when you cut a wide swath, in fact, a few months ago, I started a construction company, right? So you just get into these different elements where there's opportunities that abound. And so finding a profile where your risk acceptance is appropriate and you're willing to maybe stretch yourself just a little bit. And man, I mean, I'm convinced now more than ever that if you really do have some drive and determination, you want to do something exciting. I mean, the sky's the limit after your military time of service.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. This was a great talk tonight. I hope the people found it interesting. I'm going to turn it over to Pat for some parting words.
Again, always got to get that unmute in there. So yeah, people were really fast again, as you saw, and we actually had 2 previous winners win. So Jeffrey Steinberg, you're not going to get a second one. But Jared Kiesau, you will. And Joseph George, you're not going to get a second one, but James Murphy, you will. So our winners are Jared Kiesau and James Murphy are number 4. The answer was Mount Fuji, which the vast majority of you picked up and got. So bear with me while I want to make sure that I cover everything and we don't leave anything forgotten. We did not get all of the questions asked, and for that I apologize, but it's been a great event anyway.
Hey, Pat, can I just say something real quick?
Yeah.
And again, I think somewhat uniquely positioned just because of the transition, right? So I do want to say thanks to everyone who participated, and also thanks to the sponsors. Just as a personal note, it's great we're doing this on Veterans Day. But the reality is that it's been a pleasure working with you, Pat, and Charlie, and other members of the board, just because of the fact that there are a lot of organizations that help assist military, but Candorful is directly assisting military men and women who have served, given some portion of their life to public service, wearing the cloth of their country, and then now they're looking to transition and be successful in the private sector. And I'll tell you, firsthand experience, there's a little bit of uncertainty. There sometimes can be a little bit of just nervousness about how do you effectively make that transition. So it's great. I'm honored to be a very small part of the Candorful process, but it's great to be a part of an organization doing this. And so thanks to sponsors and to those of you on today's event who took the time to donate, because I can tell you from firsthand experience, it makes a difference. And that money is going directly to making sure that men and women who are transitioning have the best chance of nailing their interview. Thanks, Pat. Sorry. I just wanted to plug that.
No, always welcome. It makes me feel good. Thank you very much, Guy. So that's exactly what I was getting to, is thank you, Guy, and thank you, Charlie, for this event. Charlie, you just nailed it interviewing Guy. I knew you'd be perfect, Guy. Amazing video. I'm enamored with military flight. And so this was just outstanding. I had a blast. I hope everybody else had a blast. I want to just thank you again and again and again, and shout out to all the military veterans and their families who joined us today. You are in our hearts. And thank you for letting us honor you on this Veterans Day. I also want to again thank you to our Candorful volunteers who just warm my heart every time I see the feedback come in and I see your notes to your candidates that you worked with. You are amazing. And as I said, we've onboarded a whole bunch of new people, which means Shameen, you've been really busy. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you to our gold sponsor, Amazon. You guys are amazing, sending us lots of volunteers, and your dedication to military hiring is fantastic. Sands Capital, Nike, Booz Allen Hamilton, you've been great to work with. You kind of helped me work through the basics of this event. Really appreciate it, and really happy that I was able to work with you. Thank you to Giro Studios. If anybody that's listening wants to get involved with Candorful, to get job interview support or to volunteer, please go to candorful.org, candorful.org. You can connect with us there, and we look forward to hearing about you. As we already said, the answer was Mount Fuji. We have our winners. If you didn't catch Candorful's donation link in the chat, you will find the link and the QR code in the exit slide coming up shortly. Thank you, Guy, for creating that exit slide. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you had as much fun as I did. This was a blast. God bless. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Pat.